Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking into, well, something a bit different. It's a personal letter sent recently by a constituent to their Labour MP here in the UK.
That's right. And it's interesting because this letter, it really zeroes in on a huge national topic, net zero policies.
Yeah, but from a very specific angle.
Exactly. It looks at the potential impact on, working people in their communities.
And the trigger for the letter is a Substack post by someone deeply involved in the trade union movement for a long time. So that perspective really shapes the whole thing.
It really does. It's all about how these net zero policies might affect jobs, communities, the bread and butter stuff.
So our mission here is basically to unpack what this letter's actually arguing. What are the core concerns?
And specifically the tension it points out between these big environmental goals like net zero and what the writer sees as the sort of traditional aims of the labour movement. We're just sticking to what the letter itself says.
OK, let's get into it. The central point right at the start seems to build on that trade union angle you mentioned.
Yeah, it kind of lays the groundwork by saying, look, historically, unions were about defending workers, protecting jobs, getting better conditions. That was their core job.
Right, basic stuff.
And the argument presented here is that the intense focus now on net zero, well, it seems to be creating some real friction with those fundamental goals.
It's viewed through that lens of protecting workers first.
Absolutely. And this is where the letter, it gets particularly sharp. It raises a really stark warning.
Which is?
The risk that oil and gas workers could, and this is the phrase used, become the miners of net zero.
Wow, OK, that's evocative, comparing it directly to the coal industry closures.
It's a very potent parallel, and it puts a number on it too. Suggests over 30,000 oil and gas jobs could be at stake.
Over 30,000? That's significant.
It is, and the argument drawing on that history is pretty clear. If you shut down these industries without a proper thought-through plan, then you risk devastating those communities. Just like the letter argues, the coal closures broke the back of mining towns all over the UK.
So it's like saying, hang on, haven't we learned anything from the past?
That seems to be the core message there, yes. A warning against repeating history if the transition isn't managed really carefully, focusing on the workers.
OK, and building on that worry about jobs, the letter then makes a case about fossil fuels themselves.
Yeah, it argues that, realistically, these fuels aren't just going to vanish tomorrow. They'll likely be needed for, well, the foreseeable future.
So the worry isn't just about stopping, it's about how you stop.
Exactly. The specific concern raised is that pushing for a ban, quote, without a plan for what replaces it, and, importantly, who does the work, that's seen as potentially disastrous.
Right, because the implication is, if we stop producing here, but people still need the fuel, then the jobs in the industry could just, move elsewhere, overseas.
So the work still gets done, the emissions still happen, arguably, but the UK loses the jobs and the economic activity.
Exactly. And this concern about livelihoods then broadens out a bit.
How so?
Well, it leads to a wider critique. The letter suggests some net zero measures and maybe some arguments from within the environmental movement could end up actually impoverishing and diminishing the lives of the working class.
OK, strong words again.
Yes, and the writer explicitly says they believe that kind of outcome goes against everything trade unions stand for.
So it reframes the debate. It's not just environment versus economy in abstract terms, but potentially environment versus the sort of well-being of working people specifically.
Precisely. And this is where the letter brings in this idea of luxury beliefs. What does it mean by that?
Well, as the letter presents it, this means views held perhaps by a vocal minority who might be, detached from the day-to-day economic realities and job worries of ordinary working families.
I see. So the argument is that some calls to, say, rapidly shut down fossil fuel jobs might come from a place that doesn't fully grasp the immediate consequences for people who rely on those jobs.
That appears to be the implication. Yes, a perceived detachment from working class struggles.
And linked to that, the letter also touches on how the climate debate itself is sometimes framed.
It does. It suggests that from this perspective, the debate can sometimes feel like it's happening sort of above the heads of ordinary people.
Right.
And even potentially using cherry-picked science to back up more of an ideological position, rather than finding a practical way forward that considers everyone's needs. That's how the letter frames that particular point.
OK, so bringing all these concerns back to the person, the letter was actually written to their MP.
Yeah, the letter makes a direct connection. It points out that, a big chunk of her constituents are working families.
So these aren't abstract issues for her constituents.
Not at all, which makes it vital, the letter argues, for her to really consider these potential negative impacts on livelihoods, on communities, when she's involved in discussing and shaping net zero policy.
And what does the letter suggest should be the priority then?
It actually calls for something quite straightforward, applying common sense.
Common sense.
Yeah, and having a positive vision, but one that's specifically focused on defending jobs and communities. That should be the guiding principle, it argues.
So the plea to the MP is essentially what?
Take this seriously.
Pretty much. Take these worries seriously. Make absolutely sure that any plans for transitioning energy sources put the workers and the communities affected right at the centre.
Protect their livelihoods, basically.
Actively protect them, and crucially, learn from the past. Learn from what the letter views as those really tough, damaging lessons from things like the coal mine closures. Don't let that happen again.
And the letter writer offers their own background too, don't they, as context?
Yes, they do. They mention having a background in physics research and spending over 20 years looking into climate science issues.
Offering that perspective to the MP.
Yeah, presenting it as potentially helpful for navigating these really complex energy policy decisions, but always filtered through that main concern about the human cost.
So, when we boil it all down, this deep dive, what does it really highlight for us?
I think it really throws a spotlight on that core tension, doesn't it? The difficulty of balancing these undeniably ambitious environmental targets.
Which many people support, though many are coming to realise that the speed of transition is unrealistic.
Of course, balancing those goals with the very immediate, very real worries about jobs, about the stability of whole communities that are built around the industries we have. Now, the core message coming out of this letter seems to be a pretty direct call to action then.
Definitely. It's saying, look, whatever path we take on net zero, the top priority has to be protecting the workers and communities caught up in the changes. Apply common sense, learn from history, defend livelihoods.
That sums it up pretty well from the letter's perspective.
So, it leaves you, the listener, with a fairly significant question, doesn't it? Pulled straight from the concerns of this letter. When we talk about huge shifts like net zero, how do we actually address those deep-seated fears about jobs, about the future of towns and regions that depend on current industries? What does a genuine plan for transition look like? If, the ultimate test is whether it avoids breaking the back of a community.
Exactly. And listeners can read the letter in full on the writer's Substack at baffledbyscience.com.
Until the next time.